So, the worst Conquest in my opinion is Rise of Rome. This shouldn't come as a surprise if you've followed this channel for a while. My chief problems here are the map, which is way too big and empty, and the victory conditions, which make closing out this game a boring settle fest. But there's a lot more to complain about here. The Roman faction is a total Mary Sue. They get access to the most ridiculously overpowered units, not just the legions, but buffed garrisons and settlers too. Every other faction is completely half-baked. Aside from the fire catapult, there's no custom unit assets here. Carthage gets India's war elephants, but aside from that, every playable faction just gets their unique unit from the base game, and that's it. There are no faction-specific units. I can't blame them for trying to combine Alexander the Great with Rise of Rome, but this combined with the lack of custom units and empty map just destroy any potential for historical immersion. But probably my best example of how they were phoning it in when they were making this conquest is the unit roster for the Goths. I mean, all the non-playable civs get unplayably bad unit rosters, except for Egypt, but the Goths literally cannot build a unit with a higher defense value than 1. 1! They just exist to get run over by the Romans. It's absurd. Okay, 8th placed on our list is Fall of Rome. I really wanted to put this one a little higher for list diversity, but I can't justify it. This one has no flavor to it. Tech tree is probably the worst in all the conquests. The oversized map is reused, and there's no unique assets. And there's not even really any unique units either. All the barbarian factions are identical, except the Sassanids, who get heavy cavalry, and basically nothing else. Seriously, they can't even build the swordsman. The one bright spot here is Rome itself. They did a really good job of simulating it as a powerful, but crumbling and corrupt empire that the barbarians can exploit and work their way around. City elimination was a good addition, and that plus the victory points make the end game, a little bit more dynamic, and importantly, brief. Okay, number 7 on our list is Mesopotamia. There's just not much to do here. 2/3 of the game is the expansion phase, and after that, it's hard to have a fun experience when you know the game will end when all the wonders get built. Like, seriously, I appreciate the fact that this is one of the conquests with one of the larger tech trees. But what is the point of all these techs? Really? Like, I guess they give victory points, but why on earth would you build, like, for example, an amphitheater? Why would you switch governments to republic when the game is about to end? It might have already ended by the time you get to this text. Who knows? And do they not see the fundamental issue with marketing the scenario by tying its identity to the 7 wonders and having the game end before half of those wonders even actually have any effect on the game? There's no custom unit assets, although the stone and the cedars of Lebanon, which you can see here, 3 shields are a nice addition. And while the scenario did likely inspire the inclusion of the Hittites in Civ 3, they're just not one of the good civs in the game. They're just awful, and that doesn't really impress me too much. I'll say this one is fine, it's playable, it ends in a reasonable time, and I do like that they got to explore some of the lesser appreciated ancient civs, like Phoenicia and Media over here. Just don't expect something super action-packed when you play this. Number 6 on our list is Mesoamerica. This one is a mixed bag. There's no custom unit assets here, but I like the new wonders, resources, and buildings that they included. It's a really cool setting, but this is probably one of the more aces historical scenarios. You got the Aztecs running around with the Olmecs and the Mayans, not really how it happened. The victory conditions are good and novel, great even. The sacrifice mechanic is a really cool inclusion, but the one thing that they really drags this one down is a lack of replayability. There are 3 civs, along with 3 crappy clones that have the same unique unit but start with less stuff. I also don't like the map here. It's pretty much just a straight line bounded by terrain and the ocean, which makes warfare kind of boring. It also slightly suffers from the Mesopotamia issue that the game ends not too long after the expansion phase is done. I think just generally I prefer the conquest scenarios where you start with cities on the map, because it feels like it gives you a more complete gameplay experience. One scenario that doesn't suffer from this is the Sengoku scenario. It's got a relatively compact map, which I appreciate, and a longer tech tree and playtime. This allows the game to continue past the expansion phase without feeling like it's on its last limb, although the map does suffer a little bit from the straight-line-itis like Mesoamerica. Of all the scenarios without preset cities, this is easily the best job of matching the epic feel of classic game of Civ 3. The king mechanic seems a little useless here, like in the other scenarios where it's present, but at least upgrading them adds some cool flavor. The tech tree is a little jumbo, like what the heck is the way they organize these techs, but at least there's some cool things in it. This brings me to my main criticism of the scenario, and that's that it has surprisingly little flavor. I know, I spent the first half of the video criticizing scenarios for not having custom unit assets, and this scenario is loaded with them. But if I remember correctly, these were assets that had been floating around since Play the World, and they're just kind of haphazardly dumped into the scenario without too much thought of what they'll actually do. Crucially, the factions here are all identical. I would love to learn something about this period of Japanese history, but each faction is exactly the same. No traits, no unique unit. You can't tell the difference. Like, if I want to contact the purple Civ, how do I do that? Tell me, which Civ is the purple one? How on earth would I possibly know that? I mean, the serious answer is that I'd turn on colorblind help in the game settings menu, but this is a very critical oversight. It's not just in terms of actual gameplay, but in terms of making the scenario interesting and educational too. Every single faction is identical. It hurts replayability, it hurts historical immersion, and it's just a bit of a downer. Number 4 on our list is Napoleonic Europe. This one is just good. I like the variety of the different factions, and I generally think the Conquest works well when you start with all your cities on the map. Every faction has multiple options in terms of who they can conquer to win, and victory points make the scenario end within a reasonable time frame. The locked alliances are cool, but diplomacy still plays an important role here. And techs are kind of minimal. You don't really need too much out of them, but they do something. A major criticism I have is the unit roster of these civs. Each civ has a couple of unique units, which is fantastic, but there are new unit models here, but most of them are shared between several factions, despite the units having different stat lines, which makes it a bit confusing. Furthermore, the way they balance works on the different units is way out of whack. I'd say generally that Austria and Russia have good unit balance, England and France get insane troops, and all the other factions, at least the playable ones, get weak units. Bizarrely, the non-playable factions, like Sweden and the Netherlands, who I'm playing here, actually get better infantry units than Spain and Prussia do. I don't mind the imbalances like that in theory, but it's just no fun trying to fight against these units that are better than you on both attack and defense. World War II in the Pacific did this much better in terms of having different strengths and weaknesses to the units of the different factions. Factions with weak units there are in this scenario are forced to rely on the Grand Battery later on, and micromanaging a ton of artillery just usually isn't that fun. Number 3 on our list is Medieval Europe. Just so you know, in my head, I think I lumped this one with the other ancient scenarios as being quite similar, but when I sat down to analyze it, I think this one is really a cut above. I respect how they dumped multiple different time periods and storylines here, and made it all fit together in one map. It's got Vikings, Reconquista, Muslim Abbasid Wars, you got Byzantines, you got the Crusades. It's got all of the cool stuff in the same scenario. And you know what? It works pretty well. Aside from the Vikings being a bit overtuned at the start, the balance is good, and the different eras flow together pretty seamlessly. The culture-specific tech lines is a great idea, although you can hack them, as I'm doing here. And the inclusion of special wonders and buildings as well as units adds to the flavor of the different types of factions. The Crusader relic mechanic is fine. It's a little nice minigame you can choose to play. It doesn't do too much, but it's a nice addition. There aren't many custom unit assets here. The Assassin and Inquisitor are shared with the other scenarios, and the only truly custom faction-specific unit here is the Longboat, but I don't think they're really that needed, the faction-specific units. The focus here is more on Europe as a whole, and there's a lot of cool stuff. So the inclusion of the Bayeux Tapestry and the Magna Carta is really sick. I also like how the Russian faction can build both Byzantine and Viking units. I wish they'd explored that kind of blending of cultural boundaries a little bit more. But as I mentioned, using espionage, you can pilfer some of the tech trees of other cultures and do some cool stuff. My one major complaint would be that I feel like the map is a little too big in some places. The Middle East is mostly barren, and the AI naturally turns Russia into like a pulsing yak painting. But aside from that, it's quite a good scenario. Number 2 is World War II in the Pacific. This one is the gold standards in terms of creating interesting factions with cool unique units and custom assets. It's funny, it might start to feel like I'm being a bit too critical, pointing out the lack of unit assets for every scenario on this list, but it's not that fucking hard. They were clearly capable of it. All I'm asking for is that each faction, or at least each group of faction, has unique units and custom assets, and maybe a few other custom assets available to all the civs. That's done here. Every faction has its own infantry unit with different stats. Unlike Napoleonic Europe, none of these units outclass the roster of the rest. Japan even gets custom planes and carriers. I'll say there is one specific unit class that I feel is a tad bit imbalanced in this scenario. Japan literally gets double attack on their carriers. I'm obviously joking, but if you found that joke kind of funny, it wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't a real thing they programmed in the game. The Japanese carrier, I'm attacking right now, to attack. Watch me sink this battleship. Oh, wait, I got one more carrier. Can I do it? I can't even remember if I did it. Yes, I used my Japanese carrier to attack this battleship and sink it. Fantastic. This would not happen on any other scenario because you don't have those little quirks between the different unit rosters like that. The map here is fantastic. The one weakness is that the center of the map has a lot of water, obviously, because it's the frickin' Pacific Ocean. Naval combat here and fighting over one-tile islands isn't too much fun, but China and Commonwealth don't suffer from these issues, so you can just play the factions, don't really have to deal with that issue. The victory conditions here are quite fascinating. The co-op victory point scoring has a lot of potential to be really unfun, but by the grace of God, it actually has razor-sharp balance, such that if you're playing as any one of the allies, you'll win if you fight against Japan effectively, and you'll likely lose if you don't. Don't worry about a situation where you kick Japan's ass, but all your allies crumble and you still lose. The only time where that will happen, oddly, is if you edit the game files to be able to play as the Dutch, who have a lot of weak cities in Indonesia. This speaks to how well the playable factions are balanced, and that this problem is clearly possible, but it was avoided by good scenario design. Japan itself is a little overtuned, and in my opinion, it starts with way too many units and productive cities. Controlling them all is a bit of a chore, but that doesn't really affect you if you play as any other faction, and people genuinely seem to enjoy playing as Japan, so who am I to stomp on their fun? So, the number one absolute best Conquest scenario in Civ 3 is Age of Discovery. This one might be a bit of a head scratcher. I've been pretty consistent throughout this video about what I like: custom assets, especially units, reasonably sized maps, victory conditions that make for good pacing, and balanced factions with diverse kits. Age of Discovery arguably doesn't do these things better than the fourth, third, or second picks on my list, but holy shit, in terms of creativity, introducing new mechanics, and turning the dynamics of the game on its head, this one is the real deal. I might be a little biased because I did create a multiplayer fan mod inspired by this scenario, but the devs just gave me a ton of tools to work with when they made this. Let me just give you one example. If your privateer kills an enemy boat, transporting treasure, you enslave their boat, you get their treasure, and you also enslave the unit holding the treasure. That is so freaking cool. The fact they actually programmed piracy into the game this well, along with the treasure production mechanics that give you incentives to fight for these colonies, really exceeds my expectations. This stuff is just so beyond the scope of what I thought Civ 3 was capable of. It's a shame that you can't do this on a random map, but because of the fixed map, especially knowing the locations of the resources that you haven't yet unlocked, it does limit the replayability. The scenario doesn't have a ton of diversity between factions, but at least it offers two groups of factions. One of the things I like about Mesoamerica was the custom unit, or the custom assets for buildings and stuff, and victory conditions, and those are actually all present here. It might seem like it could have been a bit of an afterthought to toss them in, but it does really improve the game, and it's nice to give people a chance to roleplay fighting back against their colonizers. The civs are relatively well balanced. France is big, but they aren't seafaring. The Dutch are compensated for their size, with two of the best possible traits, and Portugal gets good positioning, and they spawn with a wonder that gives them a golden age. I like the diversity in government and how you unlock new treasure-producing resources in different areas of the map as the scenario progresses. The AI programming here isn't the best with the new mechanics, so it's easy for a human player to exploit, especially on higher difficulties, but overall, this is just a fantastic scenario. 10 out of 10. Okay, that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments what you think is your favorite Conquest scenario, and if there's anything here I misjudged or underestimated. Okay, I'll see you guys next time.